So, maybe I'll just get you to introduce yourself to start and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to this conference.
Awesome. Okay. So my name is Trina Kennedy. I am the CEO of RPA Consulting, and I'm delivering a full-day workshop today on empowering compassion and trauma-informed care. I was contacted by Betty Lynn Baker, probably kind of the fall of last year, and asked if I would be interested in delivering a full-day workshop on trauma-informed care at the conference. So of course jumped all over that. Anytime I get a chance to do training on trauma-informed care, it really is my passion. Especially with crime. I mean, trauma is relevant to everybody. We've all experienced trauma to some level, and it's really starting to help people understand that, because I think people think of those big T traumas, things like, sexual abuse and war and those sorts of things, which absolutely those are, but it's more of those little T traumas, those things like maybe you were bullied in school or your parents separated, right? Those kinds of things that also can create those big trauma responses. So I have a great group today that very diverse. We've got some counselors, we've got some RCMP, or some police officers, we've got victim services, so a really diverse group, which is great. It's making for some wonderful conversations.
All right, so how would you say that trauma-informed care could come to play for both the victim and the accused? Could you give an example of what the difference would be, like trauma-informed versus traditional psychology?
That's a great question. So for the victim, if there was harm caused by the offender, which that's what creates the dynamic for sure, is there some sort of harm caused, that can be very traumatic for the person who experienced the trauma or the harm. Not all trauma events create trauma responses, so that's the other piece of trauma, is that it's very individual. So we need the trauma response in a trauma event, but not everybody who's exposed to the same trauma event may experience a trauma response. But it's also acknowledging the fact that whatever the victim experienced was really difficult and distressing. So I think we're a lot better at providing trauma-informed care for the person who had the harm caused to them. Not so great maybe with the perpetrator, the person who caused the harm. But at the end of the day, we still have two people who are hurting. Hurt people, and we have to remember that. And it doesn't mean that's an excuse for people's choices or behaviors, but I think when we approach, especially the person who caused harm or the offender, with compassion and empathy and trauma-informed, which says, tell me your story, it's helping us have that context to the behavior. That's where people can start to heal. And if we really want to make an impact on crime, we have to create up relationships and contexts for people to do their healing. And stigmatizing, shaming, blaming, ridiculing people who already have trauma is only adding to that. We're only making the situation worse. So I'm a real passionate about restorative justice practices, because it very much looks at both that dynamic and creating support and encouragement for both the victim and the person who caused harm, while also there being accountability for the person who caused harm. It's not like it's a get out of jail free card, so to speak. But when we've shared our stories, healing can start. And then it's coming together collectively through the restorative justice process where healing can start to happen, and we can decide what needs to happen, for the harm to be addressed, I guess. So I see restorative justice practice being very trauma informed. I hope that we see more of that in the criminal justice system, because I've been part of some healing circles, and I call it circle magic. It's truly powerful when you see both being supported and just supported and healing on both sides, which is really what it's about.
Would you say this is trauma-informed care is a new approach?
I guess relatively speaking, in the field of human services, newer for sure, probably the last 20 years for sure. And it's a very fast-paced, moving field where we're just learning more and more and more. Certainly the pioneers in the field like Bessel van der Kolk and Stephen Porges were pioneers in the field. And we see a lot more information coming out about how to do trauma-informed and the impact of trauma, and which I think is important. So it's very fast progressing field for sure, but I guess it is relatively new in the landscape of all the other theories that are out there, or approaches.
I'll turn it over to Brendan in a minute,
Okay.
but this is a side question.
Okay.
I don't know if you'll be able to answer it or not. So, does somatics play a role in this too, like the body carrying trauma?
Yes.
And do you have any involvement in that?
So, yeah, the body keeps the score, right? We
Yeah.
store unhealed trauma in our bodies, for sure. And that can translate, if we don't heal, if we don't do our healing work, into physical health issues, 100%. And there's a lot of groundbreaking kind of new approaches to modalities of therapy that look more at those somatic symptoms. Even just certain yoga moves and stuff can start to work that stored trauma out of the body. So absolutely it does, for sure. And I think that in a way, for some people, feels safer when you talk about doing your healing work. That's really scary, understandably, for people because they think it means unpacking their trauma. And I think it's important for people to know that isn't necessarily what they need to do to heal. I think it's one way, but it's not the only way. And so looking at more of those somatic approaches, I think feels less scary for people. Absolutely. Yeah, great question.
I guess I kind of did have some more kind of general questions.
Sure.
But I was going to ask, so what's been one of your biggest takeaways from your panel so far?
Of my session so far?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. Biggest takeaway from my session so far: how much still needs to be understood about trauma. I think sometimes what happens when you're in this world, and it's like the lens I see everything through, and I live it and breathe it in just my day-to-day, personally and in my career as a social worker. Sometimes you think, well, everybody must know this to the same level I do, and so it's always humbling when I come to these and it's like so impactful, and there's still a lot of people that don't understand it. And trauma is one of those words that I'm now hearing everybody use, but a lot of the times in the wrong context, right? Stress is not trauma. There's a lot of overlap in terms of our physiological response, but they're not the same. And I just think we still have a lot of work in helping people understand what the difference is. But at least we're talking about the word trauma, so that's obviously a really good start. So I think just that reality that there's still lots of people who don't know, but I think there's a real hunger and thirst now more than ever to really understand and figure out what do we need to do differently as a society, because what we're doing ain't working.
I guess we talk a lot about like youth, like about it all kind of coming down to like how the youth is impacted and like how the youth is going to be the future of everything we're talking about.
Yeah.
Like what would be if you had like one message to say to
Youth?
or like to the youth?
To the youth. To the youth.
Or just to anybody that you want to hear your message.
Or that might work with youth too, maybe not directly to youth.
Yeah.
I think childhood and adolescence is such a critical time in their development, as brain development, chronological development, peer development, all of those aspects of development. And I think more so than ever, youth are faced with so many stressors like social media and just the state of the world and the condition of the environment. Like there's just so much, and I think it can feel really overwhelming and feel like lost in terms of what do we do. But I think it comes back, whether we're talking children, youth, adults, seniors, it comes back to connection. It always comes back to building relationships, finding a place for everybody at the table, and not just finding a place, but knowing everybody deserves to be at the table. It's about honoring each other's stories. It's about sitting in curiosity as opposed to standing in judgment. And I think particularly adolescents are a lot more sensitive, more so than anybody, to being judged and to not feel that they have a place. So I think it's just challenging everybody to just find a place for everybody. I know everybody has a story and everybody has value, and the only way we're going to get through this is to collectively come together as a community.
Does trauma hit different in youth, like in developmentally or biologically, like however you want to say it? Do you experience something traumatic, say when you're 10 years old? Does it hit differently than if you're 40 years old?
Depends. And why I say depends is there's so much that goes into how people respond differently to trauma. Do I think children and adolescents are more susceptible to the impact of trauma? Yes. Because for a few reasons, they don't have the same coping strategies typically that adults have. They don't have the same maybe healthy support systems that adults tend to have. Their brain's still developing, so their brains are a lot more susceptible to stress, the cortisol and adrenaline that's released in times of stress, which can significantly or maybe even permanently change the brain. So yes, absolutely. But I know lots of adults who don't have the support systems and don't have the resiliency or the coping strategies either. So at the end of the day, what people need to do to come through trauma and heal is for their trauma circle loop to be completed. And what that requires is somebody, at least one person, holding a safe space where that person feels seen, heard, understood, and empowered. And if those things can come together and that person can help them complete their stress loop or their trauma loop, then they can process it in a healthy way and move forward, often stronger than before the trauma occurred. It's really when that loop doesn't get completed that it's problematic and creates those unhealed wounds. So, yeah.
I had kind of one that wasn't really related to what we're talking about, but I guess to get to know you better, I guess like what's something that you do in your spare time or something you do for fun?
For fun. Well, self-care is a big part of my workshop because we can't help others in their healing journey if we're not well ourselves. So self-care is kind of my second area of passion. So I take self-care really important. It's really important. It's much easier now that my kids are launched than it was when they weren't and they were still at home. Definitely taking time with people who fill my bucket and feed my soul. That's a really important piece for me. But it's also, as an introvert, taking time for me to recoup and restore. Physical activity is a really important aspect in my life. So making sure I do my workouts. I'm a pickleball fanatic. I pickleball now at least 3 or 4 times a week. We just built a pickleball court in our yard, so I'll be pickleballing until my heart's content. But that's the social aspect and the physical, because my workouts are pretty individual, so I feel like I get that, and eating really well is important to me. Not perfect, but 80-20, and sleep, those things are really, really important to me for my overall self-care.
That's about all I had.
Yeah, I think that's all I have right now.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.